All right, welcome in everybody. Welcome to our second Jackson Young Professionals virtual event. I want to introduce myself. My name is AJ Massey. I'm on the advisory council for the Jackson Young Professionals. I especially want to thank our sponsors for today's event. The sponsors are Gerdau, Alexander Thompson Arnold, Simmons Bank, Voya Financial, Steve and Brad Little, Personnel Placements LLC, and Align. So big thanks to those sponsors and their investment in the Jackson Young Professionals Group. Just a few housekeeping items as per usual on one of these calls. Please make sure your microphones are muted so we can limit the background noise. We do suggest that you also turn on speaker view so that you can see either Phillip, Dellareese, or Matt throughout the presentation as they're each speaking. Please send your questions through the chat to our speaker during our speaker's presentation. Jill will collect those, and we will hopefully have some time to answer some of those towards the end of the presentation. First of all, I just want to introduce our folks that have joined us today to talk with us. Our moderator, again, is Matt Marshall. Matt serves as the president and CEO of the United Way of West Tennessee. Before that, he spent 11 years in the field of education, 8 of those in higher ed at his alma mater, Union University, where he did his undergraduate work in Christian ethics and then earned a master's in education. During his time at Union, Matt serves as the director for the Center of Racial Reconciliation and the director of Service and Diversity Initiatives. He's currently the chair of the Anti-Poverty Task Force for the City of Jackson and the chair of the Jackson-Madison County Equity Project. He's also a native Jacksonian. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. Phillip DuVentre is with us. Phillip holds a master's degree in higher education administration from FIU, Florida International University in Miami, Florida. He's worked in higher ed and studied abroad programs for the last 10 years and has facilitated multiple diversity trainings, led national civil rights tours, and held diversity positions domestically and internationally. He's a proud local graduate of Northside High School and was born in Memphis, Tennessee. So welcome back, Phillip. New to the panel today is Miss Dellareese Cofield-Martinez. She's a doctoral student in the Cultural Foundations of Education program in the School of Education at Syracuse University. She serves as the coordinator for the Democratizing Knowledge Project on the SU campus. She serves in various capacities with the IDG, the Intergroup Dialogue Program. Through her knowledge and expertise with the dialogic pedagogy and methods, she trains facilitators in areas of inclusion, specifically identity. She instructs an IGD course concentrated on race and ethnicity during her undergraduate studies in sociology at the University of Illinois. She developed a passion for social justice and education, including attentiveness to social and structural inequality. Throughout her time at the U of I, she worked with a program similar to SU's IGD program, the Program on Intergroup Relations, or PIR. Her PIR experiences at the University of Illinois included facilitating courses on issues concerning discrimination based on class, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, and disability, and that has grounded her work she's currently involved. While working on her master's at Florida International University, her capstone project focused on the social justice climate of college campuses and how to create inclusive environments for all students, staff, faculty, and administrators. Her current academic interest is in gender disability and access to inclusive education with a feminist lens. Cofield is involved in various community and campus partnerships within the city of Syracuse. Notably, she has served as the co-facilitator of the after-school lit art program for the Sidney Johnson Center, an alternative high school in the Syracuse City School District, and an after-school program for Ed Smith School, where she led a young girls developmental course. Thank you so much, Dellareese, Matt, and Phillip, for joining us on today's call. Matt, I'll now pass it over to you, and we look forward to hearing from y'all.
Well, it is good to be with all of you again this afternoon. I want to thank you for joining in this very important conversation here in our community. And I want to welcome you to session 2. If hopefully you were able to view session 1 already. I'm really delighted to be on here with Phillip and with Dellareese, who both bring a world of knowledge and experience to this conversation. And we're going to jump straight in because, again, we have a lot to cover in a short period of time. And today, our primary focus is going to be on answering questions that some of you, some of our audience members posed from the last session that we led. And so this first section, we're going to talk primarily about Black Lives Matter and answer some questions related to that. And as Jill and AJ had mentioned before, feel free to kind of also ask some additional things in the chat. And if we can, we'll get to those if we're able to. So let's jump straight in. One of our attendees from the last go round, we did speak a little bit. Phillip, you and I spoke a little bit about Black Lives Matter, but not extensively. And they asked the question that we often, hear, or they made the statement rather. I believe that Black Lives Matter, but more so that all lives matter. And then they went on to ask a series of questions, and they asked, can you explain why, why do so many people get so defensive when others say all lives matter? They also asked, can you explain why so many people go back in history when they were not living then? They also asked, why is the term my people used so much when we are all Americans and God's people? And then they also finally asked, what are your thoughts on the looting and shooting recently? Why is it okay to do these things? And why are these people not being charged for the damages? And so there's a lot in there. So we're going to take that piece by piece. And Dellareese, I'm going to start with you. Why is it that, people of color often feel offended when others say all lives matter?
Well, first I want to say thank you. I really appreciate the invite for being here. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I really appreciate the invite for being here. I think this is a very important discussion that we're having, and I'm excited to be here. It's not highlighting my name, so I'm not sure how that's going to play out.
You're all good.
Okay,
we can hear you and see you good, and you're good to go.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties, but I want to respond to your question. So why are so many people, why do they get defensive, people of color in particular, when people say all lives matter? I think what's important is to think about the history of this nation. And so not to discount the history. And I think a lot of the questions you mentioned really are kind of speaking to that. So I'm going to speak to a little bit of a few of the questions, and I'm very interested in hearing some other thoughts about this too. But the history of this country, it's built really, there's a bit of a foundation of treating others as less valuable. I believe Jill sent out, hopefully we had an opportunity to send out some articles to you all, and one of them is by Alderman, and it talks about a long history of racial preferences, and particularly for whites. And in that history, it just goes through different legislation that was put in place and how things were implemented to assist even white immigrants, right, and making it in this American society, right, to achieve this American dream. But when we specifically talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and the mobility that it's had more recently, it's about violence against Black bodies. And this country has a history of treating African Americans and Latinos with very aggressive, violent force, right, that their white counterparts aren't experiencing, and the accountability for white officers hasn't been there. And I think that when you say all lives matter, I wrote a couple of things that, because we see all these memes that I love, everyone has had to, at this point, seen the burning house, right? Picture where you have, and Phillip did a really good job at the last session, talking about all these houses are fine, but there's one house on fire. Saying all houses matter is really taken away from the fire that's happening at this one house that really needs the resources of water, and it needs the attention, right? We have to do something about this fire to put it out. Another one, a little meme or Twitter that I saw, someone said, would you go into a cancer fundraiser and start yelling, there are other diseases out there too, right? Of course, other diseases are just as important, and they deserve their fundraisers in their day. But in that moment, it is focused on cancer, right? And so Black Lives Matter is, I like to think of it as Black Lives Matter, in parentheses, invisible too, right? This country has a history of demonstrating that Black lives don't matter, right? Or even when we see something that hit me in a way that I didn't expect, was that Trayvon Martin case, right? If rendering Zimmerman, acquitting him, meant that Trayvon was responsible for his death, to me. That's how I received that. And that made me feel like his death didn't matter, and his life didn't matter. And he was doing nothing but, and not to take it back there, but really we could take it back and back and back. And so it is offensive when people say all lives matter, when they don't necessarily think about the weight of what you're saying. And really what's there and I try not to get offended, right? Really what's there is a level of ignorance, right? There's a level of ignorance that people are bringing to this conversation of not necessarily understanding what the movement is about. And so when you say that, I invite you, if you think that, to really get into what is this movement? What is happening? Why is it that people are activating in these ways to stress this point that Black Lives Matter too?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So Phillip, Dellareese mentioned there the history, right? So the history, that's the piece that often is missing in this conversation for those individuals who are making that statement that all lives matter. They're not knowledgeable about the history there. But as that person asked, why is it that people of color in particular often reflect back on the historical nature of racism, not only what they faced individually, but also what their ancestors, what our ancestors have faced? And why is that often clothed in language like my people? If, as the audience member had said, there were ultimately all Americans and all God's people.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a loaded question. And again, thank you for this opportunity. It's an honor to be here with lifelong and childhood friends, Matthew, and colleague and scholar Dellareese Cofield-Martinez. I appreciate that question, and that question raises a lot of thoughts, and so I'll try to organize them. The person asked, why do we always go back in history? So Dellareese just did a great job on touching on that. Is because it allows you to see where we are today and why we are there. Because another question could be posed, well, if I'm white and I'm poor and my next door neighbor was Black, we grew up the same in Jackson, Tennessee, how do we not have the same opportunities? Well, that's where you have to go back in history to even understand why one is privileged today as opposed to the other, who may seemingly on the surface have the same opportunities. And I think when you do go back in history, you see that studies have been done, and this is a book called White Evolution that I would challenge people to get and read. And in the book, it refers you to other great books all throughout, but there's this one chapter where it talks about studies that have been done on Holocaust survivors. And the scientific studies showed that it actually altered their DNA for those who survived that traumatizing traumatic period. And that altered DNA was passed down to their descendants. And the book raises the question, if you are able to pass down altered DNA after surviving a trauma, then what must that DNA look like for those who were putting out that trauma, who were on the other side of it? And so when you look at the history of our country, it's not just financial, but you have to look at our mental health and the emotional trauma that really took place, because you have an altered DNA and you have a traumatized people, really, that can be on both ends or on all ends. So I think it's important to go back to history to realize where we are. And for obvious reasons, you look at slavery, hundreds of years, and post-slavery, Jim Crow, the new Jim Crow, the prison industries, policing in America, and you look at all these other redlining, which is basically segregation of housing, and we talked on that last time. But you look at all these ways that Black people were affected, you can't not look at history when there are people still living today who had to live through some of those things and weren't given the same opportunities. And so the other parts of those questions, if I could briefly answer it, it said, aren't we all Americans and God's people? Is that how it was?
Yeah, it was why do people of color often use language like my people when or if we are all Americans and all God's people?
All right, I like that. And that is an assumption that, we are all Americans, and there's an assumption that we are all God's people, or people even identify that in that way. But I think I just answered it. Why you use those terms, my people, because you have a group of traumatized people. It may not be happening to me. You may view myself, Matt, Dellareese, and say, oh, they're successful and they made it. But we all probably experience a similar trauma when we see that an unarmed Black person gets gunned down and there's no accountability for it. So that's why we use the term my people, because of a shared experience based on what America called Black, the Black experience. And all Americans, I personally could agree with that. I am absolutely American. And when I look at my ancestors and all those who fought in every war for this country, and when I look at the history of this country. I see my ancestors built this country. So yes, I too am American. And where it hurts for a lot of my people is we see so much sacrifice given toward America, and we don't see that reciprocated. We don't see life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then aren't we all God's people? Well, as someone who identifies as a child of God, I think I expect, as a preacher, Albert Tate, who's educated in Mississippi, he's out in California now, but he put it best when he said what he expects of his fellow white believers or children of God. And he said, for you to see my burden, not be my burden. And I think this is a time that where we need to see and empathize with others that are hungry, thirsty, hurting, oppressed on the margins of society, and be there with a neighborly love and see their bodies as buildings. There's been a lot of people protecting buildings. We'll see their bodies as buildings and temples. The Bible speaks about your body being a holy temple all throughout. And so I think as God's people, I would expect that someone would, 1 Corinthians 3:16 talks about, seeing your body as a temple. And the next verse talks about God's perception. So seeing things through the lens of Christ, seeing myself as representing the temple of God, being my body, as God's people, as American people, a great privilege socially in this country, but a great responsibility as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned there was the trauma and how that, at the beginning, about how that literally changed the DNA of, those Holocaust survivors. And I think that someone might be quick, to come back and say, well, but, stereotypically, we often look at Jewish people who survived the Holocaust as being some of the most successful people, down the road. I think one of the things that Dellareese, as I transition to ask you a question, I think one of the things that we might want to highlight there is that historically, Jewish people have also seen themselves as having a very unique role as God's chosen people, and this very firm belief behind that. But one of the things that we see, Phillip, that you talked about, and Dellareese, that I want to kind of transition to now, is that people of color in America primarily haven't had the luxury of having that type of self-imagery. And so one of the questions that the person asked was, thoughts about looting and shooting, and essentially ultimately about the riots. MLK famously said concerning riots, 60 years ago, quote, "I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard." And then he asked this question, and what is it that America has failed to hear? And he answers it. MLK said, "It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity." So, Dellareese, why have riots persisted from Dr. King's time until now? And what would you say it is that America is still failing to hear?
I think that's a great question. First, before I want to piggyback just a little bit on something that Phillip was talking about as he was speaking, thinking about this "my people" term. I'm not sure the person who came up with this question, what environment they were in that was heard or something like that. And I don't necessarily feel like we can speak on why someone else would use the "my people" term. But
Sure.
when Phillip was speaking, two things came to me. Maura Cullen, 35 dumb things well-intended people say, and then Beverly Daniel Tatum, why do all the black kids sit together in the lunchroom?
Yeah.
And in both of those pieces, both of those authors talk about, Maura Cullen, I think, calls it clumpy, but essentially how we have this tendency to see how others are doing something, but very rarely can we see ourselves. Yeah. And so when we have this perspective of these black kids sitting together in the lunchroom, well, are all the other kids sitting together, that of similar race and ethnicity that we haven't questioned? And so that was just something you brought to mind that I wanted to share. So let's think about, let's do some perspective taking when we start thinking about why people say things. What is it that I'm saying? as well. So to your question though, man, protest. So it's so great that you brought up a quote from Dr. King, because in my little memos of things that I want to share, a quote that I was going to share is also from Dr. King. And so when you started speaking quickly, I'm like, well, is that a coincidence that we're pulling on quotes, right, from a time of the civil rights movement? We are now in a new era, and I would dare to say we are in a new age of a civil rights movement. And so it is quite easy to draw back on a time where this political unrest was as tense as it is now. And so the quote that I had pulled up is, again, Dr. Martin Luther King, March 14th, 1968. He said, "It's not enough for me to stand here tonight and condemn riots." Exactly what you're saying, right? A riot is the language of the unheard. And we pull on the same thing. And what is it that you ask, what is it maybe that hasn't been heard, right? I think I want to be careful. One, personally, I do support nonviolent protests. I think that I consider myself a scholar activist. I think there are many different ways that people activate, and it is very important for us to think about different ways that we can activate. And so that's one thing I want anyone who's on this call, and I just really appreciate people or the Zoom, I don't know what to call it these days, but I appreciate the people who show up for these conversations. And I think one thing that's important is to think about what are you taking away and to act on that. And so there are multiple ways to activate. I consider myself a scholar activist, so I've written things, right? I'm researching things. I'm trying to be the voices to folks who might not traditionally have voices, depending on how knowledge production is valued. But, and one way to activate is violence, right? But I do think that we have to take a step back when we think about the violence and the rioting and the looting that had taken place at the time that George Floyd had happened. One thing that was happening during that time, we were in a global pandemic, right? And it was known that it is research all over the place that shows that the global health pandemic had disproportionately impacted Black and Brown, specifically Black American communities more than any other race, right? So we're gonna put that on the table. We have this health pandemic, and I remember during that time, so I'm from Chicago, which it was really going down. At first it was trinkles and people, grandma died, auntie died, and then it was daily, 6 or 7 people with all these different deaths. So first we're dealing with grief. We are sad that these people we love so close to us have died. Secondly, we can't even see them because of the way they're dying. They're keeping them, right? We can't bury our people and our people, my family, my mama, that's my folks. We can't bury our people, respectfully the way our tradition allows. So now first we're grieving. Secondly, in this health pandemic, there became a financial crisis. Jobs were lost, right? All over the nation. It is also statistically shown that the people who had lost jobs, some of us were comfortable and we were able to quarantine and work from home, right? Some of us lost our livelihood. We didn't know how we were going to pay our rent, right? Stats show Black, brown people lost their jobs, right? And it was not, some folks, actually all the unemployment that got given away, some folks still didn't, qualify for some of that. And so now my people are dying, right? I'm grieving and I'm hungry. I don't know how I'm going to survive. On top of that, these videos of, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all of these things are hidden, and now I feel disposable. You compound all of that, what do you expect is gonna happen, right? And so am I surprised that people are like, hey, something I had mentioned was one of the little memes, here I am with my, staying in touch with technology. One of the memes that came across my story was a young Black fella, and I think I would say he was around 14 to 18 years old. He had a small bottle of detergent coming out of Target. One of the news folks had captured this image, and then someone else had memed it. And the question was like, wow, like he seemed real happy for this little thing of detergent. But if you think about it, who knows what his family circumstance was, that they couldn't afford a basic need, clean clothes. He valued, right, clean clothes, and he was happy that he got that. And so when we think about, I think that, the question is, what do we think about the looting, and is this something that people should do, and should they be charged for damages? violent protests have consequences, right? People lose their lives. People have to go to jail. They risk everything. How far, and this is not, I'm quoting someone, and I read this, right? How far do you have to push someone for them to risk all of that? Sit with that. How much are you really, where must you be in your life to risk your entire livelihood? You know, how far does somebody push you to say, I'm going to risk all this? If I go to jail, if I get caught, y'all cameras caught me, you know, I must really be somewhere. And so I think that I stand by Dr. King. You know, somebody is trying to get a message across, and maybe they're hoping somebody will listen.
That's great. And I think that, you know, as you mentioned, you're not condoning it necessarily, but you're saying we have to think more deeply about what's going on behind that. What's leading people to this precipice where they feel like they're at this cliff. You know, as you mentioned, the pandemic and the health and the grief is going on. Loss of jobs and income and survival is going on. And then you compound that with, you know, again, going back to Black Lives Matter, that they look at these videos, they look at what's happening in the culture, and they say, my life doesn't matter. And I can point at all three of these things to show that my life doesn't matter. And it's pushing them to this brink. That's powerful. I want to stick with you, Dellareese, for this next question as well. You know, as we talk about Black Lives Matter, you know, they have several things that they posted, you know, other mission statements, things like that on their website. One of the things that they have said is that, you know, we know that police don't keep us safe. And so, you know, one of the people in the audience asked the question, you know, how do we feel about that statement, that we know that police don't keep us safe? And then, and also they've said, you know, Black Lives Matter has said, and as long as we continue to pump money into our corrupt criminal justice system at the expense of housing, health, and education investments, we'll never truly be safe. You know, what would you say to that?
I think that, you know, I'm thinking about what I know about Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Sure.
My knowledge, unashamedly, is limited to my area, right?
Yeah.
And so I have roots in Syracuse. And so I'm familiar with the Black Lives Matter organization in Syracuse. I think when I think about someone posing this question, my question to them is, how familiar are you with this movement, right? What was your intention when you went onto that website? How many websites of organizations that you may participate in, like I'm gonna assume maybe you might be a part of a church. Have you been to your church's website and investigated their language that intensely? And so I guess I think about intent. What is the intent behind this question? You know, so that's the first thing I thought. Now, to actually address, police don't keep us safe. I do think that there is a world out there where when they see police folks walking down the street, there is an additional sense of comfort. There's a comfy feeling of like, that person over there got my back. If somebody came right now and did something to me, they got my back. And unfortunately, many of us don't get that feeling. Most of us, and I have a feeling that we can attest that most people can agree with or have experienced, is when you're in the back of your car and there's a police cop with their lights on, right? Everybody get that little pit in their stomach. That looks like, that's the feeling that a lot of Black people feel when police officers merely just walk down the street, right? When the lights are on and the police is behind you, behind your car, maybe even before you realize they coming for your car. But when you think they coming for your car, you thinking of every single thing you just did. Did I, miss a blinker? Did I pass the stop sign and I'm going too fast? All these things. And then as soon as they pass you, you're like, whew, I did go a little fast, but they ain't catch me today. But for Black folks, just walking, it's like, oh man, did I, my pants, not there to their comfort level. My shoes gonna get their attention. it's just a myriad of things that we have to go through and think through, right? And depending on what you look like, because colorism is real, and I want to put that into this conversation, you have these feelings. And so the person who asked, why is this written on that website? Well, I'm going to just dare to say, I haven't talked to those folks who wrote that website. I don't know who wrote that website, but I do have a few experiences of my own that would lead me to perhaps believe that they have some shared experiences like myself. And I don't always feel safe because I see the police. Actually, sometimes the police will heighten a situation, more heighten, be a catalyst to more uneasy feeling than anything else. And that's seen on college campuses when you have Black parties that are highly police officers are always there, but then we also have white sororities and fraternities having parties that police won't even show up, right? And so I think we see this in many sectors, right? It's not just, folks on the streets of New York and things like that can get a lot of media attention. This is the experience of a lot of Black people. And so, I think it's great to ask more questions, but ask yourself some questions too.
Yeah. It reminds me, there's this great skit, Chadwick Boseman, rest in peace. Missed that man already. But Chadwick was on SNL last year or year before, and he was on a skit, Black Jeopardy. And if you've not watched this skit, you should go watch it. And there's this question that he gets asked on Black Jeopardy where they say, the police are after this person from your neighborhood who's stolen this thing. What do you do? And Chadwick, he's playing T'Challa. He's playing like he's from Wakanda, and he buzzes and he says, not only do you tell the police what you know, but you actually go and help apprehend the suspect. Is this the correct answer? And, the host, he goes, it should be, and I love that scene because it highlights for us, the differences. And I've had an opportunity to go to Africa. I went to Ethiopia for a few weeks. And one of the things that I saw there is that by and large, many of the people there do feel that safety with their police officers there in Addis Ababa. And they feel that safety partially because the police look like them, but they also feel a safety because in their culture, which is very peaceful, they know that I actually had this conversation with people there. They were appalled at what they heard about police officers shooting people here in America. Like they could not even fathom that as being a real thing in Ethiopia. And so there's a completely different relationship with the police. And so, Phillip, when we think about, the intensity of that relationship in our culture, when we think about the uneasiness that Dellareese just talked about, and I feel that way, I shared that with you guys yesterday, that I feel that tension even, as again, quote unquote, successful as they might think you or I or somebody else is. If a police officer gets behind me, I feel tense. If they pull me over, I feel really, really tense. Is it possible to both support Black Lives Matter and law enforcement? That feels like a false dichotomy, but at the same time, it also feels like we often aren't allowed to be able to find that middle ground. And it feels, because of all the weight that Dellareese talked about, like that's such a hard middle ground to find.
That's a $1 million question again, Matthew. And I think media and even society, I would say, would like to, as you said, put those on a dichotomy and make you think it's one or the other. And Black Lives Matter is just not about Black people, it's the organization. So it's the organization of Black Lives Matter versus the policing. And to answer the question, is it possible to support both? I would say it depends on how you see that word support. So to go back to what Dellareese mentioned earlier on perception, if you look at what this teenager just did, and he had his gun, so he's out there with his gun, and in his mind, he's supporting the police. And you have a lot of people, a lot of Americans who say, someone said, he's my hero. Like, I like what he did in supporting the police. He's protecting these buildings. I would imagine that same person or people might think differently if they look at the Black Panther Party for Defense.
Right.
So a group of people, mainly Black men, but definitely Black women too, if you talk about intersectionality. And I like to, when I think about this and where I'm from in Jackson, I like to think about the Great Migration, and we might touch on that. But in speaking with one of the Black Panthers, he said, you know, his family was from the South. A lot of the leaders' families were from the South. So now they're out West, and you could view them as supporting the police, because what did they do? They asked for a stoplight to be put outside of a Black neighborhood. And a stoplight or a stop sign was never put there, but cars would race down the streets. The bus stop was on the other side. So then kids couldn't cross safely. So what did they do? They went out with their guns, and they were the stop signs. They were asking people to stop. Now, they didn't go out to incite violence or to shoot at people. It was really to protect the children. So in a way, they were doing police's job, or they were doing the city's job. So that could have looked like support of the police. So I would say it depends on your perception to see if you can do both. Now, after the Black Panthers did what they did, we know then the NRA, that was a one time that they were like, whoa, we got to scale back on how we allow people to have these guns and access to them. But I would encourage us to look at that history of that. But for your question, can you support both? I think today, in this day and time, my answer is actually yes. And I think there are a couple of things you need to do. One, you need to remember. And that's why I bring up the history. You need to remember the history of people supporting multiple causes, and also the history of police. And I could bring it up here, but I just challenge everybody to look it up so you don't think it's propaganda or my opinion. Why were police even started? To look at who they were policing then. That could help frame this conversation. And then a lot of people are saying defund the police or reform police departments. Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, for instance, I think it might be more so abolish policing or police departments. And now as I reside in Los Angeles, I try to stay in tune with what's happening locally. So I think it's the local level and a national level. Yep. Now, I know in a lot of people's minds, they're gonna say, okay, if you abolish the police department, or don't you need police also, who would you call? And if you look at some areas that have done things, I think certain forces like the police always need to be revisited. The budgets always need to be revisited and seeing how can we train better? Because times are evolving and changing. Now that we have COVID, I'm sure they've revisited a lot on how to approach families, how to approach people under COVID-19 to keep themselves safe as well. But I think those budgets constantly need to be revisited, because if you look at one perspective, you can say, well, police may have to deal with children after school, they get into things. Well, if there was enough funding going to after school programs, if there was enough funding going to schools that could, provide all the athletics or the arts and different programs, a lot of those children might be there. So there may be less to police. And I think some sort of reform is needed. You can study areas like the Bay Area, San Francisco. They've hired mental health counselors and professionals to approach non-violent situations where people don't have any weapons or pose a threat or harm to themselves or others. And they've used these mental health counselors to be dispatched after 911 calls. So sometimes police who are trained in de-escalation, sometimes they're very present, and if they're not on point with the best training that they can get, then they could actually escalate situations. And we've seen that happen, and that's where we have the term Karens for falsely accusing someone or calling 911, knowing the police will respond to an incident, and now all of a sudden the situation is escalated and it can end in the loss of a life. But I think we need to remember, revisit, reallocate budgets a lot of times to make it easier on police. And I think some sort of reform is needed, whether you believe in abolishment or whether you believe in reform. Teachers' budgets are getting revisited every year, and there are certain different budgets of the community that get revisited. I think you can support both and still agree that, hey, we may have to tweak some things. Some things are up for reform. But I think locally, you really have to think about what's going on locally in your community and be informed and use your voice and the power of your voice and the power of your vote.
Yeah. And I think that that's part of what can be difficult about this conversation in a place like Jackson, Tennessee, is because I think the majority of people on this call would say that overall we have a very healthy and good, police department. And so, I think it's hard for us when we think about what's going on locally, because then we hear about what's happening in, say, a place like LA. We hear about what's happening in New York, Detroit, Chicago, Ferguson, wherever it may be. And we can feel, locally, like there's a disconnect there, right? And I think that that's part of the challenge in all of this, when we think about these things. But I would even say from, the reform side, even when we think about police officing, about policing in our community, even in Jackson, I think we also have to think about how the world is a very different place than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And so the things that our police officers are expected to deal with now have changed. And so, to me, part of the reform conversation also has to be around, as you mentioned, a better use and a more efficient use of those funds to equip police officers with the type of training that they need. Now, I get that they receive, certain levels of implicit bias training. They receive certain levels of mental health training. But oftentimes, when you look across the board at most police departments, it's not near enough, not for what they're actually having to encounter and deal with. And then on the flip side, the trauma, like you mentioned earlier, the trauma that police officers deal with too. Now, that being said, here's the other side of it. And this gets back to why we are also saying on the other side that alongside the reform may be other requirements, is that when we talk about some of these big areas, like, the areas you mentioned, like LA, the FBI, federal government has gone in different agencies and done reviews and found mass levels of corruption in some of these places, right? Like, that's the other part of this conversation. They've gone into Ferguson and saw years worth of corruption. Same thing in LA, same thing in Chicago, like we could go on down the list, right? That's the other half of this conversation. And I think that that's, to your point, which you were making earlier, that part of that reform has to be on both sides and has to be equal. We have to be willing to be courageous enough to address both sides of that.
Yeah, I like what you said, because I think reform can actually be a way of supporting police. And I haven't talked to all the police that exist,
Sure.
but I think, exhausting mental health professionals. And I know sometimes you don't know what you're walking into. And as a person who's responded to crisis situations, I've been a part of some of those. And yeah, it does make your heart beat. But as a person who's also trained in de-escalation, I've tried to rely on my training, and I've gotten better with time with this. And I suggest the book Blink for a lot of people by Malcolm Gladwell. I know a lot of times books like White Evolution, White Privilege, White Fragility, Race Matters, those titles scare people, and they already come in with these preconceived notions. Blink is just, with the blink of an eye, we make these snap judgments. And it talks about unconscious bias. It talks about basically how these untrained biases that we all have, these learned behaviors that help us survive and help us make judgments. But the book goes into everything. It talks about police, but it also talks about everything from people who judge orchestras or audition judges for orchestras. Once they start making them blind auditions, orchestras started to become more diverse nationally. And once they made sure as people were walking in that you couldn't hear the clicks of their heels, or you didn't know if it was a man or a woman. Because what they found is people, even the most trained person, was still judging with their eyes. And so essentially what ended up happening was you started having more diversified orchestras nationally, and really you had better orchestras because now you had the best sound. And the book talks about policing too, and police who are able to better make snap judgments, especially when it comes to people who are unarmed and armed. And so I think it comes with effective training, but the book Blink will talk about that. But I think reform can be a way to support police because you're taking a level of responsibility where they don't have to risk their life for every single cause, especially when they can be better utilized in certain areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to correct something. I said FBI. I meant to say Department of Justice is the ones who've done those reports in various communities. Dellareese, as we tread, go ahead, Dellareese, go ahead.
I just had a thought about some of what you all are saying. Phillip, I really think you're speaking directly to, and I'm in the field of education, which AJ eloquently let y'all know. You're speaking directly to things you'll learn with the school to prison pipeline, right? The ideas and the thoughts that people make of young Black males that they're not making of their young white counterparts. I think one thing we talked about that I've read, right, are these scenarios, things that's videotaped before, taking your camera out was a thing. You see teachers respond to white boys who are horseplaying. There's like, oh, boys will be boys, right? And this is a very gendered conversation. But when Black boys are playing right now, now it's a problem. Oh, this is too rough. You can't do that. These, blah, 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 blah. These sorts of things, these behaviors. So I want to bring attention to the article one of the articles Jill sent that speaks to the same spirit of what you're saying a little differently, is the cycle of socialization. And I love Bobby Harrell's piece on the cycle of socialization because it talks about ways that we were socialized since birth, right? To think about different identities. And the thing that is so pervasive about this cycle is that, and I like to use myself as an example, I identify as a Black American woman. And the thing that's so pervasive about this cycle of socialization is that not only were you made to believe things, for me telling you that I'm a Black woman, there are things that you automatically may assume about my identity, but I was also taught to believe those lies about myself, right? And that is what, so when you talk about, can you be Black Lives Matter and can you support, Blue Lives? I have people in my family that are a part of the police, right? Who have found employment with the police department. There's a ton of people of color that are police. And there is this line, right, that they are forced to come up to when we're having this conversation about police brutality against Black bodies. And I appreciate at least my colleagues and some of even folks I've gone to school with who are now in the police force who say, when I joined the force, when I took my oath, that's not what they told us to do. This is not, if I was a part, I've had one of my friends is very active on his social media, and he talks about, if I was there when George Floyd was being, kneed down, I would have held my peers accountable. There is space for that to happen. And in ways that it didn't happen, which is why we're asking, right? Which is why we call for justice for all those officers, not just the one that had the knee. You just made me think about that in some pieces of, school to prison pipeline, and how the way we think about people and the way funding is something else that came to mind. Is the power is in the money. And so you ask about defunding, cops. What does that really mean? I do think sometimes people might we're not going to get rid of the policing system. We're not going to get rid of this idea of security, right? Sure. But when people are coming for the money, that's where the power is. And so when people start attacking the funds, you have a different ear. Guarantee people who might not have listened to the Black Lives Matter movement before now, when they start talking about taking away some funds, a lot of other people got involved. And so I do think that it's important to talk about not necessarily taking the money away, but I really like how you said it, Phil, is to thinking about putting these resources into other places, do some retraining, remind people, right? As a professional, for me, we do these professional development opportunities throughout the year that my organization supports me to do. They pay for me to go and remember, right? Stay up to date with the training and the technology, which never works for me. All these types of things. I appreciate that. Police should have the same sort of thing. Every field should have this, and so thinking about funding, I think is a critical move when you're asking someone to rethink how they move their money differently. Then, we'll see, right? Because you spend your money on things you care about.
Yeah. Those are all really, really great points. And I know, we only got about 7 minutes left, so we're gonna have to skip ahead to a few questions. But Dellareese, I'm gonna stay with you. And one thing I want to highlight that I think is really, really, really important that you said earlier is that we are in the middle of a new civil rights movement. I think it's important for that to be said because I can imagine that when the civil rights movement began back in the 50s, some people would say in 1955 or there around about, I don't think that people would have necessarily, those living in that time, viewed themselves as being in the middle of the civil rights movement, right? Like that's something we always look back on time and look back and put a title on or put a label on. And so I think it's important that you made that distinction. And I want to say really quickly, you also talked about social media and about technology. And I think the connection there is that we tend to forget about the civil rights movement is that, well, what's happening in the 1950s? The proliferation of televisions in people's home. So you talked about like the camera, about like the technology playing a huge part in this. And that's what shifted in the 50s and 60s. People saw the abuse firsthand being, through cable and through other things coming into their home in the same way that people are now on social media and seeing those things. But as we transition, again, we only have a few minutes left. Dellareese, I know that, you often have the opportunity to lead organizations through training on diversity and equity and inclusion. So what are some of the actionable steps that you often share with those folks that you're doing training with? And one of the questions that might go along with that is, what's the difference between an individual's responsibility and an organization's responsibility in taking these steps?
All right, I'll try to answer this as succinctly as possible, especially thinking of the time that we have left. I'm going to start with the latter part of your question. What's the difference between the individual's responsibility and the organizational responsibility?
Yeah.
So when you read literature about diversity training, it starts always with you, right? And that's kind of Bobby speaks to it a little bit, but not so overtly. You can't go asking all these other people to change and do things when you haven't done, Michael Jackson, that's my dude. Look at the man in the mirror, right? And so I think it's important for individuals to do work on themselves. Think about, where you came from, the experiences and the lives that, the experiences and the things that you were taught, but then take a critical lens and think about somebody that may have come from a vastly different background and how their lens to the world might be different. So I'm trying to pick and choose kind of what to say without going into too much debt. Once you can take a critical lens of yourself, right? Then allow yourself to take a critical lens at how you think about others, right? Think about how others are now perceiving you. It's levels to this, right? So there's an institutional level, right? But then, there's a personal level, but then we have to get to this institutional level. And then that's when we are thinking about how our ideals are reinforced, right? Through consequences or praises, awards, all this reinforces ideals that we make. I really like to bring gender and gender identity into the conversation because I think that's one of the quickest things that's easy to attach to. We were trained to believe men and women in a binary. And so anything that fits outside of what we have learned about men and women, we immediately, a woman is a tomboy if she's not as feminine as we think women should be, right? And there are these names that we've come up with over the years that complete, and I'm an cisgendered woman, right? Because now we have to understand, and I love that it's definitely something that is more in the forefront of conversations. Trans lives matter too, right? Trans Black lives are dying at even higher rates than just Black lives. And so if we decide, and there's a ton of different activists, but I like Black feminist thought in particular, we can't just be for our movement. We can't just be for whatever is impacting us. So if I'm a mom, which I now identify as, I can't just be with the moms against drunk drivers. I got to be with all folks against whatever, is important to them. And I think this is where morality and values come in. And so when you think about organizations that you are a part of, I think what's most important is to move, to act, right? I'm not going to tell you what to do exactly. Educate yourself, read some books, simple things, join community service organizations. We all know of different places that need a hand. There are tons of people who are already doing justice work, such as, your local Black Lives Matter organization that we just talked about, tons. Join those organizations and help them reach their goals. The biggest thing is that you do something. Don't just be a part of this meeting and this conversation. And this is great. Being in this conversation is a good start. Join more conversations like this that's going to have you think more critically. I know Phillip came at some authors and some of their titles, but this book, White Fragility, is a good book for some people to start with. Figure out a book that you can read that will help you act. Just don't be idle. That's my thing. I don't want to pigeonhole people to go to this place or that place. Just don't be idle. And then as long as you're not idle, you're doing something. A little bit of movement goes a long way.
Yeah. Phillip, anything that you would add here at the end?
Yeah, I think she said it greatly. And when I think about some of the more conversations that really scare people right now, I think of reparations, but it's a conversation that's actually being acknowledged. And in politics, a lot of the leaders are talking about how they view reparations. And the reason I bring that up is I think that answers the question also what we can do individually and collectively. And I think that comes with repairing relationships. And I think that's what reparations is all about. And we've done it as a nation successfully for Japanese Americans, Native Americans in some form, even for survivors of Holocaust in some form. And so it's like acknowledgement of righting our wrongs. And what must that look like for even Blacks? Comes with an acknowledgement, something more than just symbolic reparations, but mental health, the trauma that's been put on there, economic, we've had redlining. So, what could be done as far as to increase the number of Blacks that are homeowners. You can think about interest rates, how you can change those things, education, forgiveness of loans. There's a lot that can be done. And I think on the local level, you can think about your business. Last time we talked about diversifying your workplace. I thought it is important to make sure that's a place that's conducive for people of color or for Blacks, but also think about who's servicing your business. So not just who works there, but does your business have insurance? Could you go with Farm Bureau maybe? And I think of Antoine Long, who's a Jackson, basketball star, a great guy. He's doing fundraisers for cystic fibrosis. I see him involved in the community. Maybe you could contact him as a young Black male and support, just considering some of the things, considering some Blacks to service your business and your needs during COVID-19, Harvell's janitorial service to keep your business clean and COVID-free. So just how you consider servicing your business more than just who's working there, who are the face, but who you're interacting with. And for what reason? One, because historically these people haven't had these opportunities. So I think individually and collectively, we can do a whole lot, and we are doing a lot. And so I'm proud to be from Jackson, proud to have this conversation, and proud to see that people are willing to work toward repairing relationships and being accountable to represent all that we want to represent, especially Jackson.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Appreciate both of you. AJ, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Matt, Phillip, Dellareese, thank y'all so much. I'll stress again, it doesn't end with this. This is a good conversation to have, but let's go make some change happen. Just like church on Sunday morning. Can't leave the same the way you came in. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank our sponsors once again. Gerdau, Alexander Thompson & Arnold CPAs, Simmons Bank, Voya Financial, Stephen Brad Little, Personnel Placements LLC, and Align. So keep an eye out for more information on our next JYP event on all the Jackson Chamber social media, and appreciate you guys. Have a great afternoon.